There's this amazing development, I think, in the UK that's got a lot of relevance to our political debate in Australia. A new group has been started by former Labor MPs, largely, called the Mainstream. I always bang on about mainstream opinion. Well, this bloke's taken it up. Ian Austin is his name, a former Labor MP. He says politics of the UK is all screaming from the hard left and screaming from the hard right, and he wants to get back to the mainstream. Pretty good idea, I think. But what he's done, I'm going to get your thoughts on this first, Stephen. His group has surveyed Labor Party members, and what the survey demonstrates is how wildly out of step with mainstream values are the values of Labor Party members, signed-up members of the Labor Party in the UK. For instance, most of them, like three-quarters of them, think nations shouldn't have the right to decide who comes into their country. They basically think people should be able to live wherever they live, or they don't have a view. And let's get on to this one. They asked people how they feel about Britain's history over the last 300 years. And 66% of them, two-thirds of them, these are POMs in Britain who are members of the Labor Party, are ashamed of Britain's history. Let's just kick off on that one to start with, Stephen. Does this surprise you?
Look, unfortunately, not at all. The British Labor Party's grassroots have been poisoned by Corbyn's desire to protect himself and inflate his own position within the party, and he has allowed the militant tendency, old guard that were kicked out by a succession of soft left leaders like Kinnock, and they drove the militant tendency out of the Labor Party, which made it relevant and allowed ultimately the election of a successful Blair government. And it is absolutely no shock to me to see those sorts of figures, which demonstrate, as you said, how completely out of touch the British Labor Party members as they stand today. These are £5 members. I mean, Corbyn has stacked the Labor Party with a bunch of crazies. Yeah, it's a real problem. You want to see how crazy it is? Let's go to the next question. We'll go to the results on this next question. It's to do with terrorism, and it's asking people to respond, Labor Party members, to say who's most to blame for Islamist terrorist attacks. Now, only 29% say it's actually the terrorist groups. Almost as many people, 28%, blame Britain and ally Britain and US, presumably foreign policy. And 40% of people blame them both the same. Rebecca, this is bizarre and dangerous points of view, and they dominate in the British Labor Party.
Well, I have to agree with Stephen on this, and I think, sadly, it's not really just a problem for the British Labor Party. I'd say this is a much broader problem for the whole intellectual class. And you'd find a lot of people in Australia who would be university educated and are ashamed of being Australian, or feel that, you know, they don't want to... We'll see that. I think we're going to talk a little bit about this, people who don't want to celebrate Australia Day and so forth. So I think, unfortunately, this is a real problem across the Western world.
I'll show you the last one, which is sort of good news and in some ways not surprising, but it asked the survey sample, the Labor Party members, if Brexit goes ahead, which countries do they support the UK doing free trade deals with? And with Australia, 88% of them obviously supported that. So they're not completely stark raving mad. They understand that free trade with their former colony down here in the Antipodes is actually worthwhile, Sarah. I think, Sarah, the big question here is... can we extrapolate this to the Australian Labor Party? Would their membership be very hard left compared to the mainstream of Australia? And let's not just stop with Labor. I mean, I would argue, from my experience, the membership of the Liberal Party and Nationals, the people who actually signed up branch members, would generally tend to be quite strongly to the right, in most states, perhaps not in New South Wales, to the general mainstream of the population.
Yeah, look, I've got to agree with Rebecca on this one when it comes to that intellectual class who's looking back at what was and now what is. And I've been a bit disillusioned by, I think some of the words there were, you know, words used were like ashamed and things like that, and just feeling like it's just come so far and in the wrong direction in their view. I don't think that's really like reserved for one particular party above another. And yeah, I agree with Rebecca on that one. It's just a lot of people feeling that way.
Yeah, it'd be great to see some surveys taken here of the party memberships here. I suppose one thing that both parties, both major parties, have to do is just recruit more members, more proper members who turn up at meetings and go to fundraising events and all of that. I suppose, Stephen, in our political sphere here, Scott Morrison tapped into this. Scott Morrison taking the leadership in the most horrific circumstances, complete chaos and disunity. He very quickly realised he needed to focus his party back on the mainstream. Is that, in short, although there's all sorts of policy decisions and whatnot for Labor to make, in short, that's what Labor needs to do, doesn't it? Get back to the centre, to the mainstream?
Well, I think that both parties, and you were making this point, both parties their membership tend to be a little bit left out and a little bit righter than the politicians they elect. And that's ultimately a good thing. It's great to have the intellectual drive, the arguments inside the parties. But, I mean, Malcolm Turnbull was continually attacked for being not representative of the base. And many Labor leaders have been attacked for not being, sticking to the party platform and the party's base. So this is a standard, normal event. But in Australia particularly, because we have compulsory voting, if you want to win an election, you have to get a majority of everybody. And you can't just get a majority of a small group. I mean, Margaret Thatcher ran the United Kingdom with less than 40% of the vote regularly, of those who actually turned out. Put aside those who didn't turn out. So Labor absolutely needs to ensure that on issues like climate change, it does not get hijacked and be too forward-leaning. It needs to be representative of the broad range of people, including pensioners and the people who will be heavily impacted by higher electricity prices, because that is not possible to go forward unless you can give some understanding to people that they are not going to be paying through the roof and the lights aren't going to go off. A successful Labor policy will find the balance between those issues.